Hello everyone. I'm going to make a start because I know it's pretty hot, so we should get ourselves going before we overheat. Welcome everyone. Welcome to Forum 2029, our latest event where we're looking at tackling the private rental sector. My name's Jack Callum. I'm Head of Communications at the Autonomy Institute. For anyone not familiar with us, we're a leading think tank focused on the future of work and climate and building new tools for progressive political actors. This is the last event in this year's Forum 2029 series. This has been a series of panels across a range of different policy areas, trying to think about how you can build a progressive policy consensus going into the next general election. The first series we started last year had a bit of a broader overview, and we were really pushing people for specific policy contributions, whereas this year we tried to take a bit more of a focus into some specific issues and parts of that policy programme. So having looked at the housing crisis last year, we are now diving into the private rental sector in particular. This is partly because we've, at Autonomy, have been involved in some research recently with the JRF and Beth as well, on the private rental sector. So we've had one report that's already come out, another one that will shortly be coming out. I know Beth also has another paper coming out on this too later this week. It's a busy time for this issue. So there's a chance to talk about some of those issues, and also with Beckah as well, who's here to dive into some of the issues that are developing on the ground through London Renters Union. But I'll introduce my speakers in a minute. I'll introduce them now, actually. That's what's next on my cards. So we have Rosie Worsdale, who is Senior Policy Advisor and leads on housing and land work at JRF. We've got Beth Stratford, who is the Honorary Research Fellow at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, also a co-founder of LRU as well, and has worked with Autonomy on a lot of our housing work too. We have Beckah Hesse as well, who is the convener of the coordinating group at the London Renters Union. So the format is the speakers will have about 10 minutes. We're pretty flexible with exactly how long you've got, but not too long. And then we'll go through each in turn, and then we will open up for a bit of a discussion. So without further ado, can I hand over to Rosie?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm not famed for my timeliness, so do just cut me off if I'm yabbing too long. So yeah, I wanted to talk about the research that we commissioned the Autonomy Institute and in collaboration with Beth to do. But just by way of kind of a bit of scene setting, I guess, for that, I thought I would just say that I don't know about you, but it feels like there's lots of talk about rent controls at the moment. It really feels like in the last kind of 6 months in particular, there's been a bit of a kind of groundswell of momentum around rent control, lots of kind of public writing about it, which feels exciting, but also quite a sea change from where we were even 12 months ago, at least from my perspective. And I think, there's lots of reasons why it feels like that kind of momentum is emerging. There's obviously a well understood and kind of well trodden at this point failure of the first 2 years of this government to kind of really get to grips with the cost of living pressures that are affecting people, and kind of demonstrate a kind of scale of ambition to tackle those pressures. There's, I think, a lot of sort of an increasing understanding about the limitations of the approach that the government has taken so far on housing to really focus on supply at the exclusion of everything else. And also just a lot of longer term work by lots of people many of whom are in this room, to kind of push rental affordability further up the agenda. So I just kind of wanted to start by acknowledging that feels really exciting, and rent controls are really having a moment. And then I think to kind of put a pin in that, I guess, and backtrack a little bit to why we were so interested in commissioning the piece of research that Autonomy and Beth did, which looked at the rates of return that landlords in the private rented sector have been making on their investments. I think the reason why we were interested in having some really high quality analysis on that question is because, again, up until recently, it felt like any kind of conversation that you were having with kind of policymakers, policy people in the mainstream around rent control quite quickly ran into a dead end around, rent control, all well and good, but it's going to lead to massive disinvestment in the PRS, and that is going to mean landlords selling up, new landlords not investing, and that will be bad for tenants, and there will be a shortage of homes. And that was just kind of, at least it felt like to me, like the received wisdom on the question of rent controls. And so we thought that there was some real utility in trying to commission an independent piece of analysis to essentially say, like, how far is that true? What does the data actually show on the investment picture for landlords? How well have their returns been performing in comparison to kind of other investments? And essentially be able to engage a little bit with that pushback on rent controls on its own terms, on its own terrain, and be able to speak to that kind of investment point directly. So that's what we did, and it's a really kind of high quality piece of, complex analysis that I won't embarrass myself by trying to speak to the detail of. But in terms of the takeaways, what the work found is that when you look across both the rental income and the capital gains component of landlords' investments, and you obviously accommodate borrowing costs for mortgage landlords, operating costs, maintenance costs, all of these kinds of things. When you look at the rates of return that landlords have been making on their investments over the last kind of nearly 10 years, you find that against various benchmarks of alternative investments, a majority of landlords have been making higher rates of return than comparable investments, and depending on which benchmark you take, and also which year in the analysis you look at, sometimes those majorities have been almost absolute. So I think it's 2021, 99% of landlords, according to the analysis, were making rates of return in excess of the rates of return available in kind of comparable investments in the economy. And I think this is just a really powerful finding to kind of take some of the wind out of this kind of default pushback that you tend to get, which is just, paints a picture of the sector being, on the precipice of a kind of disinvestment catastrophe. Landlords barely kind of breaking even, and rent control will be the kind of final push over the edge that would kind of lead to disaster. So I think that's really powerful finding in and of itself. I think the other thing that it has enabled us to do at JRF, and what we've looked to develop on the basis of that first bit of work, is to try and think about what kind of additional policies you might want to see alongside caps on rent increases to mitigate any of the potential negative impacts that it could have on certain parts of the sector. So one of the areas, and it's worth saying, I think there are lots of different ways to approach that question of what do you need alongside a rent control, and I'm sure we'll hear from other speakers like other suggestions. So what we've been thinking through at JRF is just kind of one way to approach it, which is through the tax system. Slightly boring, but important. So we've been basically, one of the things that the analysis that Autonomy Invest did was it allowed us to kind of really look at the impact of the spike in interest rates post 2022 and the impact that was having on particularly kind of highly leveraged landlords and their ability to kind of break even or make a profit on the rental income side of their business. So bracketing the capital gains and just looking at the kind of day-to-day rental income side. And what the analysis found was that by 2024, a minority, but a kind of not insignificant minority, arguably, of landlords were making a loss on their rental income. And that's, I guess, you could highlight as a potential area of concern for the impact of a rent cap that could kind of constrain rental income growth or potentially freeze it. So one of the proposals that we have kind of made is that if you combine rent caps with a couple of reforms to how you tax rental income, which the two reforms that we're proposing, this is very techie, is restoring the ability of landlords to deduct their full mortgage costs from their income tax liability. And I'd be keen to talk that through with people because, on the surface of things, that is a tax cut for some landlords, which we think is, on the balance of things, worth it because what that effectively does is shield some of the most highly exposed landlords from the kind of potential negative impacts of a rent cap. And we think that a good way of kind of paying for that tax reform is by applying national insurance contributions to rental income. And the reason for that is it basically means that you raise a lot more tax or a significant amount more tax from unmortgaged landlords who are making massive profits because they have very low costs, and you slightly relieve the tax burden on some highly mortgaged landlords. and that's a very kind of technical bit of background, but the outcome of the new piece of research that is coming out from Autonomy very soon that has kind of forecast the impact of these combined changes is that if you combine those two tax reforms with various different designs of rent caps, kind of more or less biting, what we expect is that you would have fewer landlords making a loss by 2031 than we think that there will be just with the status quo. So that's no rent caps and just higher mortgage rates kind of continuing to feed through into the sector. So yeah, that's the kind of proposal that we're kind of thinking a lot about at the moment, is combining tax reform with rent caps as a way of kind of assuaging some of the worries, I guess, about potential disinvestment impacts. This is probably longer than 10 minutes. I'm sorry, Jack, but I'll leave it there. But yeah, would be really interested to hear what others think about that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rosie. I can say there is a huge amount of data to dive into in that first report. As someone who copy edited it and then tried to put a press release out, there's a huge amount to process and a huge amount of... Yeah, it was amazing. It was an amazing piece of work, but there's a huge amount for anyone who's interested in the sector to dive into. But yeah, I guess the long and short of it was, most landlords most of the time are doing very, very well against other investments. But there is this small uptick in the last few years, basically, and some landlords who are making losses, and thinking about how we push forward with rent controls means thinking about some of the effects on that sector if we're going to keep supply basically good. But anyway, I won't steal any thunder because I'm sure Beth may dive into some of these findings potentially or something else in the next thing. So I'll hand over to Beth before I ramble on.
I don't know exactly what's going to come out of my mouth because I prepared slides. I love a PowerPoint.
Sorry.
And there isn't a screen, so I think I might just talk you through what I would have liked to have shown you. I wanted to show two graphs that motivated me to want to research rent controls. The first one was in a paper which I recommend you look up. It's called The Housing Affordability Revolution. It's an academic paper where they looked at 5 centuries of data for 7 European cities, including London, and they looked at the ratio between wages and rents. For 5 centuries, there was no sustained improvement in affordability for 5 centuries. The decisive break came with the introduction of rent controls in the early 20th century. And finally, rents were frozen and wages had a chance to catch up. And you see it in the graph, it's absolutely extraordinary. And then you see the moment when neoliberalism kicked in, rent controls were dismantled and the affordability began to drop away. The second graph is basically a zooming in on exactly that process in the UK. So it's a graph of housing costs as a proportion of household income. I really recommend, again, looking this up. JRF have done some great reports recently showing this sort of work. And it basically shows that up until 1980, when Thatcher brought in the first Housing Act, rents for private sector renting households were about 8, 10, 12% max of household income. They hovered around there, not actually that different from the costs facing mortgaged homeowners. The Housing Act of 1980 began to dismantle rent controls, and then that process was completed in 1988 with the Second Housing Act. And rents tripled as a proportion of household income, just bam. Right by mid-90s, they were 3 times as high as a proportion of household income. And that's where they've stayed, basically, since. So the housing affordability, the affordability crisis for renters isn't actually new. It's been with us since the mid-90s, and it is an inherent product of the imbalance of power between tenants and landlords. When you look at that graph, it's very difficult to be under any illusion about the cause of the housing affordability crisis, and under any illusion about the idea that we will somehow manage to close the chasm that has opened up between costs facing renters and costs facing mortgaged homeowners, for example. And just on that question of what else we might do, obviously there's loads of talk about house building. Another piece of data that I like to display is the relationship between house building and the rent burden, the rent-to-wage ratio. there is a relationship, but if you look at the last 8 years of data that we have, and you assume that those trends continue, even if the government managed to hit its 1.5 million home target, which it won't, even if it did, the rent to wage burden would fall by 1 percentage point. And that analysis is backed up by the OBR, who project that rents will eat up the entire increase in wages that they project forward for this parliament. So, and that makes sense because the government's own reviews of the house building industry show that there's a very clear limit to how much house builders will build. And that limit is based on it's called the market absorption rate. What's the market absorption rate? It's the maximum rate that house builders can build without reducing prices. They won't build faster than that. It's not in their business model. And 2 government reviews, the Competition Markets Authority and the Letman Review, have both concluded that. So these are the main key reasons why I came to be persuaded that we have to look seriously at rent controls. What could rent controls do for us? This talk is awkward timing for me because I have this report coming out on Friday, but given that there's so few people in the room, I think I might just spill the beans, and I'll rely on you to please not go and post this on social media. So I modelled two scenarios. One in which we froze rents in November 2022. If we'd frozen rents 3.5 years ago, they would be 20% cheaper today. And another scenario where we froze them 2 years ago. Let's just go with the best case scenario. 20% fall in rents. That would save the government £2 billion a year, first of all, in housing benefit spend. And it would save the average household £2,400 a year. Now, for the renters in the poorest quintile, the poorest fifth of renting households, that is a 22% increase in their disposable income. It is really difficult. Please, somebody tell me another policy that could have such a meaningful impact for families who are struggling with the cost of living crisis, whilst saving the government billions of pounds. It's hard to think of another policy. So clearly the big, as Rosie pointed out, the big objection that the landlord lobby raise is that rent controls will wipe out their profits. So that's something I really wanted to interrogate. So I did a series of FOI requests to HMRC so that my analysis of landlord profit margins was based on real data that landlords themselves have reported their real rental income and their costs in their self-assessment tax forms. And what I discovered, again, this is not to be shared until Friday, what I discovered is that if rents were 20% cheaper than they are today, mortgaged landlords, this is the landlords with the tightest profit margins, mortgage landlords would still have profit margins that are 4.5 times bigger than the average UK business. 2 things to say about that. 58% of landlords do not have a mortgage. So they have even bigger profit margins. Second, this takes no account of capital gains. And the research that I did with Autonomy showed that for the last 8 years, 60 to 70% of all landlord returns are from capital gains. So clearly there are some landlords who will be pushed into loss-making, who will be pushed into unprofitability by rent controls, but this analysis really shows that the vast majority are rolling in it, frankly. For the landlords who would be pushed into unprofitability, the government has to have a plan. We have to take seriously that there are risks associated with landlords deciding to sell, but if the government is prepared for landlord exit, it represents a historic opportunity to restore the social housing sector and, in fact, home ownership. So there isn't a government in the last 2 decades that hasn't said that they want to boost home ownership, help first-time buyers. Here's a policy that does that takes away the competition that first-time buyers currently face from buy-to-let landlords. And the analysis that I've done shows that, so I'm sure JRF will be coming out with work on this. In the report on Friday, we go through a range of policies that could help to steer landlord sales in a useful direction and make sure that the homes that landlords are sold, the homes that they sell are bought by social housing providers, community-led organisations and so on, can go into those policies actually if we're interested in the Q&A. But what I think is really neat is that the money to support that public acquisition programme can come from the housing benefit savings that the government makes. They would make so much savings. If rents were reduced by 20% and that was sustained over a decade, the government would have enough money in savings to buy half of all the homes that become unprofitable and convert half of those to social rent. So I think I'll finish there because I can't think what else I was going to say, and I've definitely talked for my 10 minutes.
Brilliant. Thank you, Beth. Plenty more for us to dive into in the questions. So I'll finally hand it over to Beckah, who's going to talk a bit about their work with London Renters Union and a bit, I guess, how the crisis in the private rental sector is, I guess, developing. I'm going to say on the ground is a cliche thing to say, but that is what we're interested in. I guess I'm also interested as well, thinking about one of the other backdrops, not just at the moment, is the Renters' Rights Act that came in. I'm sort of interested to know, I guess, to preempt the question, what that's opened up and what the limitations have been, I guess, in terms of using some of that actually in the campaigning too. So that's just, to me, to preempt something I'm interested in, but I will hand over to you for the first time.
Thank you. My name is Beckah. I'm from the London Renters Union. I am going to talk about my experience as a renter and what I've seen on the ground. And then a bit about how our being the LRU, the London Renters Union, our vision for rent controls as people who've been working on it for a while. And yeah, that's kind of mostly it. And I have a little thing that I've written that I'm going to read from. So I am from London. I'm from a place called Newham in London, which is, I think, quite close to here. And it's a very beautiful, very diverse community. And recently, when I walk around Newham, I see these new, quite ugly, high-rise buildings and developments with very nice trees planted around them to make the local area look nice. And what they say to someone like me who is from the community, what it says is you don't belong here anymore. And that's what it says to a lot of people who have been being pushed out of these communities. And currently, our rents have been rising at record rates, as we've just heard of. 1 in 20 people in Newham are living in temporary accommodation, so that's waiting for public housing that never comes, often for many, many years, sometimes decades. And that is, as Beth was saying, that is public funds being spent on private tenancies instead of social housing. And I know from talking to lots of other tenants' unions across Britain that this is happening across the country. Communities are being torn apart. Working class people, the poorest people, people of colour are being displaced. And these rising rents means that a lot of people do not have enough to cover the basics. And in LRU we have different branches, and I'm in the Newham branch. And every week we have a peer support space. And we have lots of members who come every week, families who come every week with unaffordable rent hikes whilst also facing like criminal levels of disrepair, to be honest, and harassment from their landlords. And ever since the Renters' Rights Act, we've seen things like larger landlords putting in these really weird and extreme, like harsh rules that mean like, for example, people in shared accommodations, like people living who are renting just a room, they're putting in new rules where they're making it harder for you to add someone to your tenancy if someone leaves. This is actually happening to me as well. And it's crazy, but they're doing it, I think, out of a fear that if they add new people to these tenancy agreements, now that they cannot evict people with no fault, they can't push them out as easily. So they're more likely to want to have families. And we've seen like recent governments talk about wanting to do something about the housing crisis. But in reality, what they have been doing is paving a way for those who are seeking to profit, those who are seeking to knock down our estates and our community centres all across London and, of course, Britain. Even these so-called like discounted or affordable housing schemes where you have like 25% off of your income, off your rent subsidized, these are still disgracefully unaffordable. I was looking like 2 days ago and I saw like 1-bedroom flats for like £1,500 a month, and that is the discounted affordable rates of these like new houses. So most of the families and the people that I know that I've met on the ground can't afford to live in these places, can't afford to live in the communities that they're from. And keeping the private rented sector as unaffordable as it is a choice. It's a choice made by the government, and there are other options, there are other choices that can be made, as Beth has talked about. And I speak as a member of the LRU, and we're a member of like thousands of members, and we've been going for close to a decade, and we've done lots of research. We are on the front lines. We know the root causes, and we also know how it can be fixed. And the research that Autonomy has been doing, and that JRF has been doing, and that Beth has been doing is really, really vital. And it's a huge congratulations to all of that research, and especially Beth, whose work has really like led the way. And as a housing movement, as the London Renters Union, we've been holding our own workshops and our own research, and we also interview and speak to lots of people in tenants unions across Europe and across the world. And this is how we've developed our own version of rent controls. So now I'm going to briefly outline what our vision for rent controls is, and I urge anyone who's here who believes that there needs to be change in the private rented sector to listen. So we have 5 main points, and we also have this pamphlet where we must all join the fight for rent controls, and they're over there on that table next to that glass of wine, and you can take one. You can also make a donation if you want to take one as well. Okay, so our vision for rent controls. Number 1, the rents need to come down. The rents right now are simply too high for the majority of renters, and on this we need immediate action, which means an immediate rent freeze. And rent should be frozen for 5 years, for all properties. And then rent increases after this 5 years, should be capped and limited to the growth of wages of those earning the least. And we need a points-based rent ceiling based on the housing condition, so the condition of the house and not its location or its safety, because all houses should be safe. Number 2, rent controls that stick. So similar to the rent controls in Germany and Sweden, we are demanding rent controls that apply to the property and not just in tenancy rent controls, because that creates an incentive for landlords to evict people and then bring someone else in on a new higher rent. So, and these rents should be registered on a national database, and there should be penalties for landlords who unlawfully raise the rents. Number 3, there should be new rights for renters to withhold rent. So we should be allowed to withhold rent if landlords act unlawfully by refusing to fix like hazardous disrepair that's happening in our houses. This is common already in places like Germany and in the US. And we'd want no rent increases for properties that don't meet the decent home standards, and for properties that have very low EPC ratings, so the energy ratings of the home. Number 4, this is the penultimate one. Nationwide rent controls with local powers. So rent controls that apply across the nation, but local authorities and local tenants unions given the power to strengthen these controls based on what is happening locally. So we need a national rent commission to set these rent ceilings, but they can be adapted locally by the local authorities and by the local tenants unions. And finally, number 5, we need to reverse privatization. So we need rent controls, but of course, we also need a commitment to expanding council housing and public housing and reducing the amount of public funds that are going into the hands of private landlords. So we have been fighting for rent controls. We, being the London Renters Union, have been fighting for rent control since 2075. Since 2020, since 2020. So it's fantastic that the movement is growing, and there's places like this where people are talking about it. And recently, along with a huge coalition of over 60 organizations, we made history by helping to organize the National Housing Demonstration. And it was the largest housing demonstration in over a decade. And we all took to the streets and we demanded rent controls. And in the process of building the coalition, this huge coalition for this demonstration, we, for the first time ever, secured support from trade unions in joining the call for rent controls. And this was alongside other tenant unions and like all of the other organizations that made up these over 60 groups that were in this coalition, that are in this coalition. So we know what renters need, and renters need all of us that are in organizations and groups who are working to influence governments to be strong in our push for rent controls. And renters need any housing policy to be influenced by our knowledge and our first-hand experience. And we believe that the time for us to push for rent controls that actually work for renters is now and is today. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you so much to our three speakers. Right, I'll kick off with the standard chair's question, and then we'll open up for a bit of a discussion as well from the audience, so we can have plenty of time for that. So I guess a sort of particular angle I was going to kick off with was, again, as someone who's, I appreciate not everyone here has been able to dive into the detail of some of these reports, so I'll try not to keep it too sort of nerdy, but what's quite nice is that the way our autonomy reports break down a picture of landlords' profits over recent years, it is broken down both by sort of rental returns, but also returns you get from capital gains, i.e. like how much your house has increased in value over the course of the tenancy as well, right? And recommendations we put forward, autonomy put forward, along with the JRF, cover principally looking at, I guess, the rent side of the equation mainly. So looking at national insurance contributions on rent to be put up, and then some of the section for claiming relief on mortgage rates as well. So there's some touch on that. We're also aware from what Beth said as well in her contribution, however, that capital gains is a really big part of the picture of returns for landlords, both in terms, in particular, the attractiveness of landlordism as an investment in the first place, right? So even though I'm aware it's not a particular focus we looked at in rent controls here, but how much is looking at capital gains tax reform a really important part of the picture here on rents? And I say that as well, having just sort of looked earlier today in the sort that Tony Blair was telling Andy Burnham, please don't do this. So maybe it is an important thing for us to do, but between sort of Rosie, Beth, Beckah, capital gains, is that something else that needs to be part of this package? Is it an essential part, or is it a separate part of thinking about tackling this issue?
Yes, so I'm glad you raised that actually, because I think that capital gains tax reform can play an important part in allowing the government to manage the pace and direction of landlord sales. So I've got a figure here from a piece of Positive Money research. This is from 2022, so it's a bit out of date, but they found the average landlord who'd purchased in 1990 would realise £240,000 in capital gains when they sell. Now, because of that creates a lever for the government to use to affect landlord decision-making. Because a landlord's decision about whether or not to exit the market, if rent controls come in, they will also be thinking about their capital gains and whether the capital gains in future will compensate for the lower rental income. Included in that calculation will be expectations about what is going to happen to the capital gains tax rate. Now, if the government hikes capital gains tax, which it should to share out the unearned gains that have accumulated with the landlord class, it also allows the government, if the pace of sales is disorderly, too fast, if they're worried, oh my gosh, there are too many people being evicted at once, the government can clearly indicate, we are going to bring down the rate of capital gains tax on landlords when we are sure that the demand from first-time buyers and social housing providers is able to absorb the properties coming onto the market. That creates a clear incentive for landlords to defer their sale if they have built up a lot of capital gains in the expectation that they will have a lower rate of tax in future. It also means if the policy is we will lower the rate of tax on properties that are registered in the landlord database that has been brought in under the Renters' Rights Act, it creates an incentive for second homeowners, if they're planning to sell at some point, to convert their homes into long-term lets, right? Because otherwise they won't be able to take advantage of the lower tax rates in future. So it creates a supply of new rental properties onto the market. It also creates an ability for the government to say, we're going to give a preferential capital gains tax rate if you sell to first-time buyers, if you sell to social housing providers, if you sell to housing co-ops. It also allows the government to introduce what's called a capital investment allowance, which is basically like an allowance based on the opportunity cost of capital for landlords. So it's another way, as Rosie was explaining, one way of helping landlords who have got tight margins is to reverse the changes to mortgage interest tax relief. Another way is to introduce this investment allowance. So it's something that they could actually draw down on an annual basis and use to manage cash flow issues. It's quite geeky. I've got a whole chapter about it in my report on Friday. But basically, that's quite a long-winded answer to say that I actually think the capital gains tax reform could have a very large role to play in managing the potential outfall of introducing rent controls.
Fantastic. I'm actually going to squeeze one more question in, which I preempted for Beckah as well in the sort of thing. You spoke a little about in your report about potential changes you've seen in the sort of landlord attitudes and problems since the Renters' Rights Act sort of came into force. Have you? Is there anything else maybe to add to that? I'm just quite interested in potential changes in landlord behaviour. If that's had any effect really quite quickly in recent months, basically post Renters' Rights Act for you as a union. Yeah. Yes. Sorry.
I think the main thing that I've seen is the thing I mentioned about these new rules that people are trying to protect themselves from having to take on like new shared accommodation tenants, but also tightening how much you have to like prove to be able to, because when you start renting, as many people might know, you have to like go through reference checks and get proof of your income and so many things. So there's lots of like tightening around those things as well. But I don't have too much to add apart from the fact that before it came into place, there was a huge hike in people, in landlords filing Section 21 like no-fault evictions. So we're seeing a lot of people who are being affected by those evictions that came in just before it came in.
Can I just add on that? That was the point that I was going to bring up, and I think one of the learnings of the Renters' Rights Act legislation is that I think because it took so long and the end of no-fault evictions was telegraphed so far in advance, I think one of the kind of anti-regulation talking points in recent months has been like, look, this is what happens when you kind of regulate and intervene on the PRS. You just cause all these kind of perverse incentives and renters end up paying the price. There's been a massive spike in evictions. And I think it's really important for us as advocates of actually, no, we need to go further on regulating and kind of intervening in the PRS to learn lessons about how to do it better. And I think this is one of the key ones, is that, if you telegraph a big change, and this would be really important for rent control, right? If you telegraph a big change really far in advance like that, you are going to get a lot of behaviour seeking to kind of circumvent those rules before they come in. So thinking about the implementation and how you do it to avoid that feels really key.
Yeah, I mean, so there's sort of nugget of housing information is that's sort of relevant to me is that, I mean, I live in Cardiff in Wales, where the Housing Act, Wales was passed in 2016. Well, I think Wales went to one, but hasn't, which in practice gave the government the ability to abolish Section 21 evictions, but the Welsh government still hasn't done, 10 years of Welsh Labour government didn't quite do so. Plaid, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Plaid, I believe, still haven't quite got around to doing it. So yeah, there's been a long wait for it to happen in Wales. So hopefully, the Welsh government are thinking about the situation that happened in England. Right. Questions from the audience. We'll try and do bunches if people have got sections of questions. So put your hands up, and I realise I'm sat at the wrong end to have a roaming mic, but shall we just do it via? What do you think, Will? Yeah. Is that all right? Sorry, I've disabused my host duty and sat at the wrong end. Right, fantastic. Questions?
One here. I've also got one, but it's abusing my privilege.
Yeah, I've rented for 10 years, but I did actually buy a house in Peterborough. I lived in there 5 years, and now I rent in Whitechapel because it's cheaper than commuting. The train costs are insane. One class of landlords actually are very special that I think people don't really understand it, but if you have a talk with an estate agent, they always mention them. Accidental landlords. These people are the ones causing like 99% of the problems. I actually have a very professional landlord here. His mate is his builder. Everything gets fixed. It's really nice. No rent increases for 2 years. It's like, he's professional. Whereas like accidental landlords, they just pick up the phone. The estate agent says, oh, you know, local area rent has gone up. And they're like, yeah, increase mine too. Even though it's like a 200-year-old Victorian outhouse that they're renting out to somebody. So I think like this severe like rent increases, apologies. Having these very harsh incentives, basically pushing landlords out the system and decreasing the amount of rental properties. I think that could be good to just push out the accidental landlord, saying like, look, you don't need to be a landlord. If you had taken your house money, smacked it onto like an ETF on the global market, you would not be faffing about with, you know, some tenants from your house that you got from your uncle who passed away and then you got it through an estate. You would be actually making more money and having a nicer time. And this would actually create an incentive to professionalize the rental market. I think what you guys are talking about is, you know, specific price fit, reducing inflation, helping people out with their day-to-day cost of living. It's really great. But I think just the entire sector has this kind of like I'm not sure how many accidental landlords exist, but they have this massive like problem with accidental landlords. It's just very obvious that they are causing 99% of the problems.
I've got the mic. Question for Beth and Beckah is, we have the Green Party are talking a lot about rent controls. They seem to be allied on a bunch of this stuff. We have a new potential leader of the Labour Party who's made gestures toward this, although of course there's headwinds from the party which often make people less or more conservative and so on. I guess my question is, in terms of policy, do you guys have like, do you think, for example, a national policy is where it's at, or do you think there's also something to do with local authorities, given that both Burnham and potentially the Greens are seeing, well, they definitely have a, they definitely both want to, in some sense, devolve power and resources. Do you think there's what kind of pairing do you see between local authority policy with perhaps beefed up, more muscular local authority power and also a national policy? Because I always think about rent controls as a national policy, but I'm starting to think actually with Burnham's devolved kind of preference and so on, what does that look like? I'm not sure what that looks like from a campaigning angle and also from a more policy angle, but also the policies that you're after as well. Like, what's that link between the two? Anyone else? Wait, okay, we'll do one more and then we'll do another second round.
Question to anybody, really. You mentioned that average rents as a proportion of income has sort of tripled since the post-war period. Without like a huge reduction in house prices, is there any way that like there's a feasible way to get back to a level which, maybe not talking like 10 to 15%, but certainly lower than what 40% that we're at now? And if it does require, assuming there's not going to be a huge increase in wages, which I think we can kind of assume, if it does require a huge reduction in house prices, what are like some of the externalities of that, and how could they maybe be mitigated?
Right, fantastic. So we've got accidental landlords, we've got sort of local authorities, I guess, a devolved question. I might even add to that as well, thinking about opportunities at the sort of national devolved level where housing is devolved to for some of the experimentation on this, I think has happened. And then finally, can we get anywhere without properly, can we get anywhere without reducing house prices, and what might be some of the problems with that? So you want to tackle accidental landlords first?
I can say something about that. I mean, I think you're totally right, and we hear the phrase accidental landlords often. I think, what do I think about that? I think I agree. I think you're right that there are basically a lot of private rented homes are currently being provided by people who aren't invested, pardon the pun, in being a landlord, in providing a essential service for people. And I think also the churn, the kind of structural churn that you get from people kind of inheriting a property for a while, maybe they sit on it for a bit, then they're like, oh, actually it's a bit too much hassle, sell up, is a big driver of kind of structural insecurity for renters. So I think you're right that it would be a good outcome longer term for the PRS to have fewer of those landlords in the sector. I think what's a really interesting point about this from a kind of political communication, I guess, angle, is that this is quite a hard point to land when you talk, what I find when you talk to kind of like members of the general public about this. And I think this speaks to the fact that although there is like widespread, multiple kind of polls show that there's like widespread support for rent controls amongst the general public across different political persuasions. It gets quite difficult when you start talking about impacts on different kinds of landlords, because I think what you find, and this is actually, I think, reflective of the fact that like being a landlord has become such a common aspirational thing, is that almost everyone will have a good landlord that they know. It'll be a family member, it'll be a friend, and that, I think, has a really powerful role in a lot of people's kind of, I guess, willingness to embrace these more kind of, these ideas that we should be more interventionist in really proactively shaping both the size and the kind of composition of the sector, because I think a lot of people are more instinctively sympathetic in some ways to the idea of the kind of accidental landlord, because I think, they're more likely to know someone in that position, and I think are more willing to sort of see bigger corporate landlords, for lots of understandable reasons, as kind of as more kind of recognizable villains. So I think that's just an interesting point of kind of I guess like political and policy communication, that I think you're right in a kind of diagnosis of a kind of a structural problem in the composition of the sector, but I think it can be challenging to communicate that to people for whom it doesn't make for who know and love an accidental landlord, which seems to be a lot of us, I think.
Anyone else on accidental landlords? Anything to add? Nope. So next was thinking about, I guess, the local authority level, and I'm not recomposing.
Well, but basically, if the local authorities get more power and resources and actually want to act on this, what would be the policy at a local level alongside the national policy?
Brill, fantastic. Anyone keen to tackle that one?
In our booklet, which is over there, on page 62 or 63, I forgot what number of the five-point plan for rent controls it is. I think it might be the third one. There's we outline how we would like rent controls to be set nationally, but for there to be some power from local authorities and local like tenants unions. And I think part of that for me personally is I think there's some examples of housing policy that is set nationally, but it doesn't always apply. It can't always apply in the same way to different contexts. For example, like the people might know of the like concept of priority need, like those who are more likely to be housed by the council faster due to like having an illness or having children, and that is a policy that's set nationally. But while some councils have like a little bit of discretion about how they treat this, it's hard to. I think it's quite strange to have a policy like that councils have no real legal discretion on, when you don't really know who is really in priority for different reasons in that particular context. So I think whilst it should be something that is definitely set on a national level, we should be thinking about like how is this applied by the people who are actually in the places, in the smaller context where it's going to be carried out in real life, if that makes sense.
Fantastic. And then finally, house prices. Beth.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, right? Because this is like the dilemma for, like, actually solving the housing crisis isn't rocket science. Like, we know what's pushed house prices up and we know what's pushed rent prices up. The difficulty is doing it without causing a housing crash that then pushes loads of homeowners into negative equity. I think, however, most of the proposals that are seriously under consideration with rent controls would be like, at the most radical end is a rent freeze, which means that on day one, the rent is exactly as it was yesterday. And so it only bites slowly over time. Wages rise and the rent stays stable. And that's really what we want to happen with house prices as well, right? We want a stabilization of house prices and then wages to sort of catch up slowly. And I was a bit nervous. In 2019, I worked on a report for the Labour Party under Corbyn, and I put a lot of thinking into how you would mitigate the risk of a house price crash, and came up with some out-of-the-box proposals, which, you know, I stand by. But I'm less nervous about it now. I don't think that rent controls of the kind that are on the table would cause a house price crash. I think they'd just bite more slowly over time. And also, actually, the thing to add is that we're outlining policies that would enable first-time buyers and social housing providers and local-led organisations to be in a position to buy the homes that landlords sell, so there isn't like a sudden kind of dearth of demand in the market, and I think that would help. Some kind of house price correction wouldn't be a terrible thing, as long as it doesn't kind of really punish people who've just bought at the height of the market.
Great. We've got some more time for some more questions, if people still have them. This gentleman here. Yeah, well, I mean, plenty will. You can pick them off.
Hello. I come at this from a sort of urban economics perspective, but I've also managed the procurement of private rented accommodation and attempted to regulate private rented housing. Failed completely. I think just 3 points. One is I would caution against any proposals which require local authority staff to spend a lot of time dealing with it, because they won't, because of the costs. We're not talking about a time when local authorities have lots of money, and even if they did, they wouldn't do that, because it's very time consuming and very expensive in staff costs. That's number one. No, so obviously there has to be some kind of rent regulation, there has to be, and so on, dealing with evictions and so on. One thing I would say is that the best way of dealing with landlord malpractice is to empower tenants. And that means making it simple, so that tenants can see what can be done and also can get advice as to how to operate the system. Anything that does not use that is missing out on a potential workforce who will be highly motivated to actually deal with that situation. My final point is I'm slightly worried about any proposal which looks at a range, at a sector, whereby you have a very profitable end, a less profitable end, and then a very unprofitable end, and tries to consider policies to protect the least profitable end, because it's very hard to see how in economics you can do something which will cushion it for the least profitable end and not give super profits to the most profitable end. So I would caution against any policy on that, although I'm very keen to see your graphs, Beth, and so on and so forth. But my question is, has there been... I've permanently been worried, having been involved in procuring private rent accommodation for temporary accommodation for local authorities, or being responsible for that, and seeing the issues on that. What is the problem with disinvestment, with landlords selling up? Because the properties won't go away. They will sell to somebody, maybe another landlord, maybe, and so on. And they will just have to... So I think politically, there is an opportunity with Burnham to actually push a more ambitious agenda. Reading what he's saying, and also he'll be pushed by the Greens as well in that direction. I think we can be... And I take the point about that we've been working, and I've seen the mass campaigns in the Telegraph letters pages whenever there's been anything that has come out about renters. But I think that they are out of the action for the next few years. So that there is an opportunity, relatively rare opportunity, both in terms of political intent and political balance, to actually take a situation whereby the hard luck landlord gets cushion, gets sort of in some way, but in a very short-term, temporary way, while their property is disposed of. So I would be relatively hard line on that, sort of protecting the hard luck landlord. Thank you.
Fantastic.
One over here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ignore the autonomy staff member and go to yourself.
Thanks. Thanks all. Really interesting stuff. I think Rosie, you mentioned about the profit margins and everything, and I just wanted to kind of gather whether they are significantly above, like, just in general, like, investment returns, so that, and I guess the reason for that is, how justifiable is it for then either local authorities or central government or whatever to just use, I don't know, financing mechanisms to buy up those properties, essentially, if the rate of return from being a landlord is significantly higher than that. Essentially, does that just justify mass buying? Yeah.
Well, fantastic.
One more?
One more, yeah, go on.
And then we'll come back.
Thanks everyone. I'm really not an expert in the history of rent controls, but parts of my understanding was that the debate around it in the 1960s there was a lot more kind of agreement that rent seeking and landlordism is bad for the economy in general, and that rent controls would also just shift the economy more towards a less rent seeking type of centered activity. And I was wondering if you think that we are making the most of that argument today, and essentially that there are wider benefits to rent controls as part of a shift away from quite inefficient economic behavior, and that rent-seeking activity and just those wider benefits that they would have.
Well, fantastic. Where do we want to start? So I guess the first question looked at, is it so bad for landlords to sell off in the first place?
Sorry.
Go on, Beth. Kick us off and then we can share this.
Can't help myself. I 100% agree with you. I don't think it needs to be a problem for landlords to sell. The sector doubled in size, not because anybody wanted to live in the private rented sector, but because landlords outbid first-time buyers. And so I think the survey data shows that about 3% of people want to live in the private rented sector. So if we shrink the sector to a size that accommodates those people, that would be great. In terms of sort of technically, how do we ensure that landlords sell to the right kind of buyer? The only disastrous outcome would be if landlords sell to a second homeowner, obviously. And obviously, I'm being facetious. There are other bad outcomes. If a landlord sells if a landlord has to evict their tenant in order to sell, then there's obviously consequences for the tenant. So the range, if it's okay, I'm just going to run really quickly through the policies that I think are quite important to bring in alongside rent controls. One is increase the notice periods to at least 6 months. That already is the minimum notice period in Wales and France, for example. A second is have mandatory compensation for the stress and expense of relocating. Already exists in LA and other places. I forget where. And the other one is to have a sequential right of first refusal. So already, if it's an ex-local authority, an ex-right to buy property being sold, the council that owns the adjacent properties or the housing association has the first right of refusal. So what I would propose is that if it's a home that has always been owned privately, the sitting tenant should have the first right of refusal. If they can't afford to buy the house, they should be allowed to assign that right to a non-profit of their choice in return for getting a secure rental contract to be able to stay in that property. And that kind of system already exists. So in France, you've already got a first right of refusal for sitting tenants, same in Portugal, Catalonia, and then in San Francisco and DC, Washington, DC, they have this kind of, first of all, the sitting tenant, if they refuse, then the sitting tenant can assign that right to a social housing provider or a co-op or whatever. And it's allowed lots of affordable homes to stay affordable, basically, or be brought back into the affordable ownership. And then I think there are a range of measures that you need to do to ensure that homes don't pass into under-occupation. But I think they're kind of obvious to us, is like raising taxes on second homes and clamping down on short-term lets, both through the planning system and the tax system. I won't go on because I think that the rest of that is kind of obvious.
Fantastic. Also, a quick clarification from me. No-fault evictions did get outlawed in Wales in 2022. There we go. But it did take 6 years. It did take them 6 years, but it did happen. So yeah, that exactly. And Beth is correct on that point, as I quickly Googled. My next question was on rates of return in the private rental sector. Does that justify mass house buying? I guess it was largely directed at you, Rosie.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I guess if the properties are being bought up by social housing or providers or council housing, you would want them to see them. You'd want to see them charge lower rents on it, which would lower the rate of return. And I guess the capital gains element isn't so much of a factor for the rate of return for a local authority if they're planning to hold it long term. But I mean, I think it does speak to a broader point, which is that, there are, actually I was at a conference yesterday speaking on this topic, and I had a long chat afterwards with a landlord, and he was kind of saying, look, I'm a rational investor. I want this rate of return across my portfolio. Some of that will be high risk, I'll have some high risk, high return things in there, and I also want my kind of very low risk, very dependable assets. And he was saying, if local authorities issued housing bonds that you could invest in that gave you a 4% rate of return guaranteed, I would absolutely have some of them in my portfolio, because that's my safe bet. That's the bit that sort of insures me against if the stocks and shares go wrong. So I think your question really points towards, like, there are dependable returns for local authorities or social purpose investors, or even just your rational investor wanting a safe bet in providing affordable housing that isn't looking to kind of rent gouge from people. So yeah, I think that there is an investment case there for sure. It's just it's not, I guess, extractive in the same model that buy-to-let home ownership is. Can I also respond very quickly to the question from this gentleman about does protecting hard-up landlords cause bigger profits for the ones at the top end of the distribution? And I think that was a really interesting question. And I think that the analysis that we have done with on the basis of the data analysis from Autonomy suggests that the tax reforms we're proposing kind of squeezes the distribution at both ends. So you kind of you bring in the tail of the histogram. Bring in the tail of the histogram on both sides. You have fewer landlords both at the at the kind of very low end of the distribution, and you also have fewer at the very high end of the distribution. So that's our understanding of how it would work. So, but I think this is definitely something. It's a broader political conversation that we've had about these kind of policy solutions, where you definitely don't want to overcorrect and do so much to kind of prop up it's definitely not a good policy approach to just say we will do whatever it takes to prop up any old landlord who is not making a profit, because that's not a good way to do housing policy. Totally agree with that. But yeah, I think that our hope is that there are reforms that can squeeze it in both directions.
Just should probably also answer James's question, that question you had at the start about what is the relation between the landlord profitability or return on investment and other investments. That is the question on our first report.
Which is great. I mean, and as a very, very quick dive into it, because I promise I won't run into it, but just to give a sense of a picture, I think it is useful. So it looks at 2018, 2021, 2024. So significant majority, so more than 2/3 in all of the cases, and in one of the years it was close to over 90%. So that was big majorities saw post-tax returns greater than 5.9% in 2018, 3.6% in 2021, that's a slight downtick, 5% in 2024. And the sort of post-tax, so including all tax, mean total return for landlords was 7.1% in 2018, 7.8% in 2021, 5.6% in 2024. That's because unencumbered landlords do mentally well. If you don't have a mortgage, you make mad money on houses. And finally, so in terms of how many landlords were actually losing money is tiny. So 2018, so the post 0.2% of landlords lost money in 2018, 0.2 in 2021, and 1.2 in 2024. So like hardly anyone, basically. So just a bit of a scale.
But like, so one more thing on that is that basically, to answer your question, what we modelled was high risk investments, low risk investments, and in terms of like stocks and shares or government bonds, basically. And so you can see it all in the report about how landlords come out better that on most, in many instances, perhaps most instances, according to the relative other investments, as if you're an investor, you go in different ways. So that is, I mean, you should look at the report if you're interested in that question.
Yeah. As an extra point, it's really interesting talking to landlords about how risky their investment is, because they really think it's very high risk, which is kind of funny when you say to them, like, have you heard of the phrase like safe as houses? You know, there's a reason. I mean, like, but seriously though, I mean, like, I feel like I have grown up in a time when the received wisdom is like, if you have the opportunity to become a buy-to-let landlord, why wouldn't you? It's like, it's the kind of the easiest and best thing you could do with your money. So, having that conversation about like what's the kind of appropriate comparative rate of return for a buy-to-let investment it's an interesting one.
Fantastic. I guess the final question was around the sort of culture of, or sort of wider political culture of rent seeking and, asset holding. How much of that is a barrier to tackling some of these conversations? I mean, Beckah, does anyone else want to jump on that at all?
Yes. I mean, so I wrote a PhD on rentierism, rent seeking, rent extraction. So it's like a real passion topic of mine, and obviously, like, you know, the economy would be better off if people invested in productive assets and in businesses that were doing useful things rather than just buying up existing assets, right? But interestingly, I did a message testing study because I wanted to, I was like, wow, this is really persuasive. If only we can show everybody how these landlords are making unearned incomes and they don't deserve it and they're absent landlords. And so I thought, well, let's try actually advocating for rent controls using different frames and different phrases. And I threw in my rent-seeking frames into one message, and then I made one which was just focused on the experience of the renter and kind of like a sob story, like, isn't it hard for the renter, da-da-da. And then another one that was somewhere in the middle, I can't really remember. The other one compared landlords to other monopoly powers like water companies, train companies, energy companies. The one that was most effective was the sob story. It was just getting people to empathize with the experience of the renter and what they're going through. The one that was least effective was the one that was like blamey and moralizing and saying these guys are getting unearned income. Now, I 100% believe that narrative, and it makes me angry. But I also want us to use language and framing and messaging and campaigning that speaks to the widest number of people and brings them on board. And so... So the conclusions that I reached was like the thing that's going to be most effective for us winning rent controls is to talk about the experience of renters and how fucking hard it is, frankly. And except that the parallel with the monopoly power did work a bit. It was kind of in the middle there. So I think like because people have first-hand experience of train fares they can't afford, energy bills they can't afford, water they can't afford, and they can see that there's like a power imbalance there that they have a first-hand experience of. Maybe that can translate a little bit. But anyway, that was just anecdotal. Not anecdotal. It was a representative sample of 2,000 British adults actually. But
Fantastic. One more round of questions, potentially, and we can all have a nice cold drink. Go on over here.
No, but there's burgers too. Don't worry, there's still one.
That's fine.
I went to a landlord investment show today. I'm not a landlord. I'm a activist for the London Renters Union, and there was, as we were being dragged out by security, they don't like it when the London Renters Union goes to the landlord. People who run landlord investment shows don't like it when the London Renters Union also tries to attend the landlord investment show. As we were being like dragged out, I saw someone with a sign saying like, "Do you own more than 50 properties? Come and talk to us." Like their niche in the like business to business, like services to landlords is like, we want to provide services to people that own more than 50 homes. So yeah, it's such a good way of making money. I wanted to like ask people, everyone's opinion on the panel about like, there was this really fascinating but really terrifying thing when Rachel Reeves, when it got leaked that there might be a rent freeze. And the only time that I've seen these kinds of like social movement from above, like the Telegraph, the Times, the BBC, by like day 3, The Guardian was reporting like Rachel Reeves might lose her job for maybe suggesting that a rent freeze would be a good idea. And the only times that I've seen like social movements from above so effectively like change the narrative is like Israel, like transphobes, people who really didn't want Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister, like incredibly powerful groups of people with access to a lot of money and a lot of power. And if we get close to winning, like that will happen again. And what is our response to that? And is there not a danger, like, that if we come out and say to the ruling class, don't worry guys, we don't want to change that much, that actually we lose the ability to build a movement as well. Because we win stuff when we increase the cost of our demands not being met by showing that there's a movement. And I'm a bit worried that our current plan seems to be like coming out and saying we don't want to change that much. And like we were working out how to like do some comms around the stuff that Beth's going to put out on Friday, and we were like, oh, there's a bit of a danger here that if we say, don't worry, nothing's really going to change, that we... Yeah, and so yeah, what is our plan? What should our plan be when the ruling class say, actually, it's our job to protect the profits of capitalists and we're not into your plan, as nice as it is? And like, just, yeah, do any of you have any other thoughts on like, what have we got? What are some of our strengths as a movement right now? And what do we need to like sharpen up on and focus on and get better on so that we can actually get this over the line? Because we really have a huge opportunity and we really need to take it.
Fantastic. I was going to say get that person a drink, but we've got free drinks for everyone, so you can definitely have a free drink for them. Bhargav.
Thanks a lot, all three of you, for your different contributions. I've learned a lot. My question is kind of similar to yours, but for a different audience. It's still a comms question. For better or for worse, a lot of my friends are like well-meaning liberals, especially from the past. And often I kind of just like it's common sense we should have something like rent controls, but I had no idea about the economics or the kind of math or the modeling aspect. It's more like an emotional plea. But unfortunately, these friends would say things like, and I'm sure if I read the reports, you've directly spoken to these things, so my apologies for making you repeat yourself. But some of the things I would hear, it would reduce the number of housing stock because it's not as good an investment anymore. Other things would be the cost of maintenance goes up, so how do they pay for that? And kind of similar arguments, which kind of, market chuds or just liberals in general would make. But I do want to be able to answer these in good faith, and I do think that there is that fight we're going to face in terms of fighting that, but there's also the fight of trying to convince just, random people who might have bought into that propaganda. So I'm just wondering, how do I, apart from you spoke a little bit about the campaigning bit about appealing to the struggles that renters go through, and if someone is not amenable to that, is there a kind of market-y kind of response I can give that, no, actually we'll have more houses, actually we'll adjust these as maintenance costs go up, or other kind of responses I can kind of give to a liberal who is probably not going to fall for some of the kind of more emotional pleas, and was definitely not going to be on board with the politics, but might be convinced from a market perspective. So just for, my slightly annoying friends who I still love, need to talk to. So, thanks.
Fantastic. Anyone want one final question? Go on, then. I'll have one final one.
Oh, yeah. I was actually thinking about the commodity form of housing, because I was on a stage and just said it straight to me. He's like, yeah, how much do you want for this commodity? I was like, yeah, I need a place to live. It's a house. And but yeah, so in the energy industry where I work, every 10 years or so, Saudi Arabia just says, okay, the price of gas and oil will massively drop on purpose and knock out all these, also-rans, these fakers until you make it kind of people in the energy industry, the little frackers in the Midwest, just knock them out, just clean out the system. I think when you say rent freeze, why do you want to focus the policy around rent freeze when you could just say, a housing market correction, like you earlier referenced, and say to Andy Burnham, how about we just have a housing market correction? If you want to treat housing like a commodity, every commodity has a correction, so what will make housing so special? Just, allow people to have 12 months notice.
That's good. I think some of those questions might be related in different ways. How can we build the sort of social power to resist reaction from above? How can we convince our liberal friends? And why, maybe relatedly, might a major correction of social housing not be sort of valuable? I mean, just ahead of that, sort of some of those points that I'll add to it too is that, a great thinker once said that being determines consciousness, and a lot of politicians are landlords. I know the Welsh stats off the top of my head, but Welsh members of the Senedd are 7 times more likely than a member of the public to be a landlord. The current First Minister for Plaid Cymru is a landlord, the Finance Minister is a landlord, the Leader of the Tories is a landlord, the Leader of Labour is a landlord, the Leader of the Reform, Leader of the Opposition is a landlord. But it makes a difference. But anyway, I'll hand over to other people to sort of talk a bit more about how we can build the power to tackle it and convince our liberal friends. Beckah, do you want to start?
Yeah, I don't have that much to say. But I'm really interested I'm kind of going to add to the question or just emphasize the question because I'm really interested in what other people think. Because when I think about these people from above, they're very well funded and very well connected. And I'm just I always think, how do we use the same tactics of people, of these the transphobes and build the same power that they have with which is lots of money and influence on politicians. And I don't know, unless we could find some rich people to join the LRU. And I think you should read our pamphlet. Just sick, because there's some myths about rent controls, and one of them is lots of landlords will leave the market and there won't be much housing. And I think there'll be lots of answers. I think different things work for different people. For some people, in the LRU and in other groups I'm in, we have these things called organizing conversations, where we have a structure to how we talk to people about the issues that we're talking about, that we're fighting, and it kind of brings people along, and it makes people you kind of get into what does this person care about and what is this person interested in, and you kind of use that to bring them around to understand how the issue is connected to them and everyone around them. And I think for anyone you're talking to, whilst you like ask them questions like, why do you think that? Or like, what is it? But when you figure out what it is that they're interested in or what they actually care about, you can figure out how to respond to them better. And maybe they're more responsive to stuff about the economy and the graphs and the tax and all that kind of stuff. Or maybe they're more responsive to most of us are suffering. But yeah, it depends on the person. That's all I have to say.
Fantastic. Rosie, Beth?
I've got a couple of thoughts in response to Bargov's question. On the house building argument that we'll see a slowdown in house building, I think it's important to both point out, so the actual empirical studies of the relationship between rent controls and house building are inconclusive. So there's not a very strong and consistent relationship, and often where rent controls, for example, they have exemptions for new builds. That is a very common exemption where rent controls are in place. And I think, although I would say politically speaking, that might be a concession that we make, just to say, look, here's a concession to the build to rent sector. You won't have rent controls in place for 10 years or something like that. Another thing to say is that places with the places with some of the highest build rates in the last few decades are like Sweden, Netherlands. I actually have it in my report here. I'm just going to look. Finland, Norway, Switzerland. In the sort of post-war 1955 to 80s period, they were the fastest house building countries. They all had strong rent controls in place. So it's really clear that where you do have the right policies from government to support house building of the type of homes that are needed, house build rates will be fine. And so, yeah, I mean, we have obviously problems in our house building sector, but as I alluded to before, they are a result of our over-reliance on the speculative private house building model. And, you know, according to the theory, high house prices, high rents, according to this sort of neoliberal theory, those are precisely the conditions that should have led to really high rates of house building, and they simply haven't. So clearly that's one way to come back on that question. And then similarly with the idea of maintenance, like the conditions in the private rented sector are appalling compared to every other tenure. And so it's clear that having unregulated rents doesn't lead to high standards in the private rented sector. And we're going to have to rely on sanctions and fines and so on for landlords who can't meet basic standards, as well as the right for tenants to withhold rents when landlords don't fix things in time. And I think, yeah, I should stop talking.
Fantastic. Rosie, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think maybe trying to respond to the first and third questions kind of together, which is like, yeah, I really take your point, and like about, what is the movement strategy? Are we kind of preemptively compromising too much? I suppose was like maybe the concern. And yeah, I think it's a really difficult one to balance. And I suppose my sense is that the moment feels very like potentially quite urgent, and like there is like a time limited window where we might be able to win something that didn't feel like it was on the agenda or anywhere close to being on the agenda until really quite recently. And so I suppose, I'm thinking back to like why I started off what I said tonight the way I did, which is like, I think it's, there's, despite the fact that it feels like things are moving quite quickly, there's still so much, my sense is that there's still so much deeply grained policy resistance to this that is a real counterweight to what I think is like a growing kind of organic groundswell of like pressure from voters, from movements, from politicians who recognise the lived reality in their constituency, and I think that. So I suppose my feeling is that if we want to be if we're going to win something soon, we need to have a strategy that is like both operating on the kind of building that popular support and kind of, as you say, building the sort of the prospect of the pain of inaction, and also a part of the movement that is trying to clear some of those potential blockers on the kind of policy maker side and kind of policy influencers side, I suppose. And I think doing that latter prong of work does require, I guess, engaging with the problem in a slightly different way. And I suppose, being willing to try and assuage some worries that, of different parts of the movement might disagree about how big of a concern they are or how much we should be willing to compromise on them. But it feels like that there's a prong of strategy that is needs to be geared towards removing those blockers. But obviously, those prongs also interact, right? And the more powerful the movement is, the greater the potential appetite for risk and of actually doing something bolder will be in the policy sphere. But I think, I feel the pain of the question is a long way of saying that. And the reason why I was going to relate that to the third question about the language of housing market correction is, I actually do think this works kind of well when you talk to economists, is my sense. And I say this as someone who is normally an observer of these conversations because I'm not an economist. But I think that's why there is utility in having work like the work that Autonomy and Beth produce that allows you to have that conversation on those terms. Because actually, if you can pin down some of these sort of market-centric ways of thinking about it and put people who view the problem in that perspective a bit on the hook and say, okay, but it kind of exactly as Beth said, the market logic should be that now is boom time for building houses because they're worth loads of money and you can get loads of rent from them, and that's not what's happening. So if you can engage on those terms, I do think that can be part of the strategy of unblocking some of the blockers on that kind of entrenched policy attitudes about rent control side, I think.
Go on then, Beth.
Okay, I just have one thing to say, and it's sort of on the sort of movement solidarity. It's very tangentially related. It's not really related. I just wanted to say it. I just wanted to say that I think one of the ways that we are going to win is through movement solidarity and generosity within this movement. And on that note, I wanted to say that this report that I'm bringing out on Friday was actually due to come out on the date of the Makefield election. It had to be postponed, which meant that Autonomy and JRF had an opportunity to get their research out before me, put me to the post. And I think it should be publicly acknowledged that they very, very generously and graciously stepped back and delayed the publication of their second phase of research in order that the report that Joe and I are going to bring out on Friday has the best chance of getting coverage. I won't say any more than that, but it's really appreciated, and it's really I think it should be praised as an act of movement solidarity and generosity.
Thank you, Beth. We're all friends. We're all friends and comrades here. Right. We've been at this a while. All that's left for me to say is a massive thank you to our speakers. Massive thank you to everyone who's come and put up with a fairly warm room to ask questions of us on a Wednesday. Massive thank you to everyone at Autonomy and Oxford House as well for hosting us. It's an amazing venue. You host your events here, come here outside of it. We're really lucky to have their support. They've gone over and above for us a lot of times, so I really want to say a massive thank you as we come to the end of this series. London Renters Union have got their pamphlets. Don't forget that on the way out. You make donations. Other than that, thank you very much. We have some drinks. Please take some drinks.